Jada. It's so nice to be chatting with you. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. We are doing a little bit of a special episode of On the Porch. I really want to dive into the work you're doing and all of the things. So thanks for joining us. Well, me. You will also notice, regular listeners, there's no Logan this week. It's just me. So anyways, welcome to On the Porch.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here with you.
Yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit. Tell me about what you're up to, the work you're in, and kind of how long you've been working on this.
Sure. Well, I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I've been teaching here since a long time, since 2016. And at first I was teaching between the School of Music and the School of Information Studies and our Digital Humanities program. But in 2022, I started formally just in the School of Information Studies. So I teach our Information Studies is like our School of Library and Information Science. So teach predominantly graduate students, and they go off and work in information management or the public library or archives. So it's a really like fun and vibrant place to be and to teach. But like it also, I think for a lot of people feels very strange because my background is in musicology. So I have a college diploma in piano performance, and I did my undergrad, master's, and PhD in music history. And I've been researching country music since 2006, since I was a master's student. At first, it was the thing that I did on the side because I was a Soviet Russian music historian. But then when I transferred into my PhD, that's when everything started to change. I was researching the Chicks. I was looking at, their blacklisting from radio, that the album Taking the Long Way had just come out, and I was really, really invested in looking at the ways in which women in general and that band specifically were treated within the music industry. And then I did my PhD on country music, so I sort of have stayed there ever since 2006. But I didn't always do what I do now. So my first work was really like traditional musicology of research and analysis around, songs. But now I do data-driven work that looks at representation within popularity charts, which is where I started, radio airplay, and then tracking that. What I'm interested in or invested in is tracking data systems. So tracking, representation from label rosters through to radio airplay, through to charts, through to awards. I haven't made the leap to festivals yet, but I certainly do watch what's happening on festivals. But like you can really see the ebb and flow of representation in the industry most visibly through festivals, and then when you start to trace it back, you can see the sort of cyclic nature of representation within this space. So I've been doing this work since about 2016 when I finished my PhD, or at least that's when I started. But I've been doing most of this work very publicly through my research program SongData since 2018.
Is SongData through the University of Ottawa as well, or is this entirely yours?
It's entirely mine. I launched it in 2018 when I was a part-time professor teaching through 3 different departments. I had received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, as we lovingly call it. I love that acronym. So I received these 2 grants to do research on representation, and I thought, well, a big part of this work is going to be public. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what that would look like, and with the great help of my dear friend Travis Steimeling, we came up with SongData, which is studies of networks and genres through data.
Yep.
And at the time, I really thought that it was going to be largely a website where I make my research available, but that I blog. I had this blog that I launched called Keepers of the Flame, that was going to be about the women in my data sets, and spotlight songs that like reached number one, or songs that like maybe were only on the charts for a couple of weeks, but that made a big cultural impact. And within like, I don't know, 6 months of starting the blog, I started doing this really public work, releasing reports. I'm like, well, I can't do both. So I focused mostly on data analysis these days, and really since April 2019, I've focused on that. And so it is my research program at the university, but it's a website that I manage and maintain, and I use predominantly as a space to share all of the work that I do.
That's so interesting. Are you a music nerd at heart? Like, how did you fall into this?
Oh, yeah.
Like, we all found our way here somehow.
Yeah. I'm a total music nerd. You know, I mean, I can give you the full music nerd story. I've always been obsessed with music. You know, my first tapes were New Kids on the Block and Debbie Gibson and Janet Jackson. And what was I, like 8 then? But we moved to the country when I was 9. I was born in just outside of Montreal, and we moved to rural Eastern Ontario, and you know, probably not the most exciting move for a 9-year-old, but in retrospect, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. For a couple of musical reasons. One being the elementary school that I went to was just like the most musical place. We had like concert band, like, yeah, we had concert band and jazz band and like, what did they call it? Oh my gosh, dancing groups where you lip sync. What are they called? Oh shit. Anyways, I did those. I was like, okay, I was super involved in all of this stuff. So in grade 3, I picked up the clarinet, and I played clarinet until like grade, I don't know, 6, and then I switched over to saxophone. Got into high school, played oboe and bassoon. I went to college. At that whole time, I was playing piano. Went to college and did a diploma in piano performance, and where I minored in bassoon and played in the North Bay Symphony. Like, I have a true like music nerd, like love of music background, but so that's like predominantly like a concert band classical world. But then I had this whole other piece of me that really was shaped by radio. You know, everything was a drive. So we go to swim lessons in the city. It's a 30-minute, you know, each way trip. To go grocery shopping, everything was a drive. So radio played a big role for me. I became obsessed with radio. And I would do this thing like where we drive into Cornwall so that we could go to, you know, my synchro class or swim lessons or whatever, because I also did synchronized swimming. And I would like memorize the countdown, and then I would come home and I would tape the countdown. I would like take my parents' old tapes and I would put Scotch tape over the end. So sorry, Mom and Dad, if you're listening. And I would tape the countdown. It was like my version of streaming. I mean, I either couldn't afford or like didn't have access to those recordings. So I would listen to them on my own mixtapes that I would remake each week, or I would use those tapes to teach myself those songs on piano. So I think of some, you know this song, I'm sure, Automatic by Miranda Lambert, where she says, you know, I taped the countdown because I didn't have them yet. And I was like, that was me. That song has always resonated because that's me.
So
from
visual.
Like,
that's you. Yeah.
Like from 9 or 10 onwards, that was me. And so I'm a total music nerd. Super obsessed. I've gone to concerts that range from like, you know, Korn to Holly McNarland and Sarah Harmer to like CMA Fest. While country is my passion, I listen without without genre boundaries. I'm very much invested in this project called music. And so yeah, I'm a total nerd.
I love that. I actually have a similar experience. I didn't start in the city and go to the country. I started in the country and moved to the city, but we only had a couple of radio station options.
Right.
My parents grew up very much in a small town and the next town is 15 or 20 minutes away. Like you said, everything is a drive. For us, it was going to hockey practice and karate lessons and dance class that I would never, ever get excited over ever again. That wasn't really my thing. But even, like, just going to see everything is so much further away. So the radio was the soundtrack to your travels.
Yeah.
And, yeah, we listened to country radio. Our country radio up here is independent, so it was... There's so much random Canadian music that when I moved to the city, even my friends who liked country music, I was like, oh, you don't know this song? You don't know this song? And then you realize, oh, it was like on secondary radio stations or non-reporting radio stations, and they didn't hear it in the big city on their bigger radio stations.
Yeah.
But I remember for years, I will admit this, I always said, this is where these things like come into play so interesting. I don't really like hearing women on the radio. Conditioned by the radio.
Sorry, I have to log off. What?
Conditioned by the radio, right?
Yeah.
And one day I realized, I was like, I don't dislike that. It just doesn't freaking it doesn't happen. I called my friend. This was like a couple months ago. The station I was listening to, I'm Toronto based now. The station I was listening to, I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but they played women back to back. And I noticed that stuff now in a good way. I was like, holy shit, that was back to back. Why is that such a huge thing? Because it just isn't that frequent. Yeah. So it's so interesting. We talk about this all the time as somebody who's like so into this. My best friend one day was like, do you remember when you used to say that? And I was like, yeah, but I know exactly where and why it comes from that. Like, streaming platforms become available. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And when I have more available to me, there was no, I don't like listening. I was absolutely. So it was so interesting to see the shift. Yeah. From that younger experience. It lasted till I was in my I was a late teenager too. So.
Well, we're trained by the media around us. And so when you don't hear anything for long periods of time, and then you do, it's like it breaks with that cycle of familiarity that has been trained in you to listen to and for certain things. That repetition of white male voices, doing similar lyrical things, similar sonic things, especially, I would say this is probably at its most homogenous during like peak bro country years, where it was just like the same. I mean, the Sir Mix-a-Lot mashup or whatever. Yeah. Where you hear like 6 of those songs all mashed up, like you could move from one to the other and have the exact same lyrical narrative, the same guitar riffs, the same chord progressions. It's really striking to think about the ways in which that programs a kind of monotony into your world so that anything that's not within that realm becomes jarring to your ears. And so like the thing that interests me about like this whole conversation about familiarity bias is it's intentional. Like these are programming decisions that have been enforced since the 1960s. Not to play songs by women back to back is an actual rule that they use in radio. And I'd say by the same token as like they don't play songs by black artists back to back. These are two things that are programmed and encoded in programming manuals. The piece that fascinates me with this is they use the fact that they've done this forever and that they have high audience ratings as a marker of why to keep doing it. But they've never done the opposite. there's never been a period in the history of the country music industry, just to like stick with the format, where they've programmed women at a higher rate, where they've done the opposite of what they've done. I've studied the entire history of the industry's charts. The highest point of representation of songs by women was 33% in 1999. Otherwise,
funny because people will say that's like the peak women in country.
Because there were more. There were double.
Yeah.
Not only was the percentage doubled, so the charts were 33% through the back half of the 90s, but there were more women, period. So there was a greater diversity of individuals having songs on the radio and chart. Whereas like, the last 2 decades, it's been like 2 or 3 at a time, right? Like post Chicks, it was like Taylor, Carey, Miranda.
Yep.
And they're no longer the big 3. It shifted into, I don't even know that I can really do this anymore. I used to be able to sort of position it like Casey, Kelsey, Marin, but never quite to the same level as Taylor, Carey, Miranda. And we're like, and then there was like a little bit of Carly. We're like in a Carly Laney world right now with a bit of Megan Maroney mixed in.
Yep.
But it's only ever, and I'm missing the one moment of having Gabby Barrett in there, but like it's only ever 2 or 3. Carrie Taylor Miranda was like the peak moment of 2005 to 2010, where they had slightly more consistent hits made by radio. And since then, it's been this sort of like cycling in of a couple, but never to like Lainey has achieved things in the last 2 years that took like Carrie several years to do. But they're always blonde. They're always white. And there's only ever a couple at a time.
It's so interesting. We've jumped in and maybe not going chronologically anymore. But you've been doing this very specific research for quite some time. I did say we would talk about, let's circle back, but let's start with some of your work that you did in 2019.
Sure.
How does it start there, and how do you like progress and get into what you're studying right now?
Yeah. So, the work with radio, I started building those data sets late 2018 and then adding in the 2019 data, early 2019. But really what happened was I had been working on this massive project on Billboard's Hot Country Songs that looked at representation of women on that chart, but also working through all the methodology changes to that particular chart, which, was a straight from radio, then it was the hybrid chart, and looking at how every time there was a change in the methodology, the most impacted artists were women. And so that came out that was published in an academic journal in October 2018. And I had the great privilege of sharing it with Todd Cassidy, who manages the Song Suffragettes. And he tweeted it. And a lawyer in LA who works on radio regulations was like, oh my God, can you please send this to me? I need to read it. And she and I got to talking, and she said, I'd like to use your article as part of a brief that I'm submitting to the FCC. And I was like, sure, absolutely, like whatever you need. And then she said, do you have like radio data, like without the chart methodology, just like straight from radio? And I was like, no, but I'm actually looking to get my hands on it now. And I had been collaborating or starting a collaboration with Women of Music Action Network in Nashville, who are an anonymous advocacy group. And so I got access to radio data. I started building these data sets shortly after the lawyer and I talked, and then released this massive study that looked at 2,002 2002 to 2018 that we released in April 2019. It was also included in this brief that was submitted to the FCC. The National Association for Broadcasters had put forth a request to further deregulate, and she was part of the team with Music First and Future Music Coalition. She was their legal representation to submit a brief against further deregulation. And so that announcement came down in January of this year that there will be no further deregulation. So they sided on, they came down on the side of like wanting to protect diversity and localism, which was great. But yeah, so this all led to that first report, which, April 29th, 2019. I can remember it. Sometimes it still feels like yesterday. But it was the first report of its kind to look at direct from radio airplay. And so we tracked the decline of songs by women for 2002 to 2019, 18. We released a follow-up in December 2019 that took it even deeper and looked at time of day at which songs were played. Surprise, surprise, songs by women are played mostly in the evenings and overnights. And then I was invited to be part of CMT's Equal Play initiative. So I did a special report that looked just at 2019 for them. And so I was down in Nashville for CRS. We launched it. It was interesting. It was also, I should say, that was the first of my reports to consider representation through more than just gender. It was the first report that gave statistics on representation of women of color. And so it was for me, that report sort of marked a turn in how I do my work. And since then, it is out of absolute necessity to be as intersectional as possible with that work. Because as much as white women have, many barriers, Black, Indigenous women of color have just a concrete wall in front of them. And so really unpacking what representation means within the industry with a much more nuanced understanding of how these various systems create different types of barriers, and how white women have access problems, to be sure, but the doors kind of open a crack for them. And trying to always put this within a historical context. That's really key to me. It's not enough from my perspective for us to understand what is going on today. Because today is an issue, but it's just a repetition of 100 years of this same activity. So for me, it's really integral that whenever I have any conversations or any opportunities to write about the industry today, that the history is always presented alongside it. So I outside of those early reports, the one that brings me perhaps the deepest sense of depression is the one that I released in March 2021 called Redlining in Country Music, which basically took the same data but looked entirely from the racial perspective. So it does provide gender representation, but it just flips the way in which I do all of my visualizations and forces the really hard question of how is radio still programming at 96% white artists? How is the industry still doing this when we know that this is an industry that is built on the musical traditions and culture of Black people? That some of the greatest innovators to music in general and country specifically are Black artists. How is this industry still exploiting and stealing from Black music and Black musicians and getting away with it? And so it's a piece of the discussion that I think in some parts of the industry they just don't want to have. But I'm here for it because that is the story. that is like, we need to start from these structural oppressions and look at the ways in which they then impact everyone else in the ecosystem.
It's interesting too, because what you're saying in terms of like the history of country music is brand new information to a lot of young people.
Yeah.
This is something
to a lot of old people too.
You know what? Yeah, you're right. And it's just, is it lack of like education? Is it purposefully putting one thing on display versus the other? It's a lot. And you see like right now, I think A Bar Song by Shabuzi is going to hit number 1 in a week or two in the US, and that's going to be monumental.
Yeah.
That's going to be monumental. It's so, but it shouldn't be. It
shouldn't be monumental. It should be an ordinary, regular thing.
It should be. And that's a real cool thing that he's going to achieve and be part of.
Yeah.
But yeah, it should be something that isn't such an irregular occurrence, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this often because I actually do always find myself a little bit surprised when I'm in a new room with people that I've meeting for the first time, and when I talk about the racial segregation of the industry through race and hillbilly records, and I get that like, what? Kind of like glazed over look. And I mean, it's tough because a lot of people who work in the industry don't have a music education.
Right.
Right. So like a lot of people come to their roles within the industry from many different disciplinary backgrounds. Makes total sense. You would not have 100 musicologists doing this. How dreadfully weird and boring would that be? But you have people coming from communication, from psychology, from marketing, from management. Everyone's coming from their own disciplinary backgrounds. None of them have taken a course on music history. And some of them might have. I'm not trying to brush the industry with one blanket. Look at me mixing metaphors. It's not a monolith. Everyone has their own understanding of history, but a lot of people jump into music history with the day they were born, and their sort of knowledge just goes forward. A lot of people aren't necessarily doing that work to go back to look at what was happening in the early 1900s. That's not that's not a Saturday afternoon activity. But I think it's an essential piece of knowledge that, and not just country, the entire industry. I think everybody needs to know, because this doesn't just impact country. It actually impacts the entire industry. When you think that race and hillbilly records were marketing labels designed in the 1920s as a way to market and produce and promote artists, but those were just renamed to R&B and country in the 1940s with the development of popularity charts via Billboard. And they're just repeated every single day in the ways that labels are divided and studio systems are divided, and that little thing called radio formats are divided. They were already segregated in the 1920s in black-owned and white-owned radio in the way they programmed variety shows, like live performance. When it switched to DJs and then to formatting in the 1960s, that all just followed. So that segregation of the 1920s is so pivotal to understanding not just the past, but the present, because it's still going on today. It's still embedded in every single thing, right up to DSPs. So without knowing that history, there's no way forward for change. It is so integral that anyone working in the country music industry, even if they don't read the book, just know that. Know that this space was racially segregated on design, and that built into that are different forms of other forms of oppression. We think of the Carter family as the pioneering first family of country music, but who were they taught by? Black musicians. And when they entered the recording studio in the 1920s, they were told a woman in the lead will never sell. So already within this one like foundational trio, you have exploitation of a black musician and the absolute erasure of his story from their narrative in some spheres. If you go down to the Carter Family Museum, you read very little about Leslie Riddle. And the birth of a cultural belief that women don't sell. That phrase, women in the lead will never sell, has followed white women in this country music industry since the 1920s. It is not new, right? Like, it's not new. It's been said in 100 different ways over the last century. Women are blamed for low ticket sales. They're blamed for low alcohol sales at venues. They're blamed for, low ratings on radio. Like, women get the burden of the blame when something doesn't succeed. And I think if we started to trace this language backwards, we'd see just how deeply ingrained it is within the system, who never believed they should be there to begin with.
I'm trying to think of, for people who want a crash course, there's a Netflix series, I just thought of it, it's called Explained. And it's a 20-minute episode on country music. And that gave me all the tidbits to start thinking. And I remember walking over to my best friend and I used to be roommates. I walked over her bedroom and I was like, do you know country music is rooted in the black community? And she was like, yep. And I was like, okay, sorry, my bad. But have you watched, like, come watch this? And we started it over and watched it together. And she had that knowledge, and I was sitting there like, where has this been hiding from me? So encouraging people who are listening to take a quick, if you want the short, sweet synopsis, that's a great place to look. Have you read, it's the book my best friend, same best friend, bought me for Christmas. The book is called Night Train to Nashville.
Oh, I've not read it, but actually that comes from the Country Music Hall of Fame, right? Based on the museum exhibit that they had in 2008 and 9 was, so I interned at the Country Music Hall of Fame in the last year of that exhibit. And my dear friend Michael Gray curated Night Train.
So she buys me this book. I think she thought it was going to be something really cool, and it turns out to be the history of country music in Nashville and radio, and these key figures. I forget their names, but regardless, one of their daughters is the author of this book, and I was fascinated. It's music in the 40s and the 50s and following up, and these people who were so integral to this evolution of black music on the radio, for starters, and it was just very fascinating. Not what I expected it to be, not what she expected it to be, but it was very interesting to learn. It dove a lot deeper into that.
Is this the book that's by Paula Blackman?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna quickly check to see if there's any relation to the Country Music Hall of Fame. I would imagine there must be. I've not read this book, so I will be
highly recommend
it. But the exhibit in Nashville is available online now. So if you go to the Country Music Hall of Fame website, you'll see, and it was such a beautiful exhibit. And, for me, that was foundational. So I was in the U.S. and I'd started my PhD, and in my first summer, I interned in the public programs department at the Hall of Fame. And so I would write bios for their singer-songwriters, poets, and stuff that they were doing. I'd also get to sort of just spend time at the educational and outreach activities. So we did musical petting zoos where I would teach people to play the dulcimer. It was a hoot. It was the best 4 months for me, because that exhibit was going on. They'd opened the Brenda Lee exhibit, so that was fun, but they also had this, and I think it was in its final months, And Michael Gray, who's now the director of like the research and curation component part of the museum, had curated it. And so he gave me this really special tour where he walked me through and talked about all the artifacts. And it was so foundational to me to see this exhibit housed, like, because it's not just about country, it's about R&B in Nashville, housed within the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in a city that is incredibly racially segregated, but was the birthplace of modern country, well, the enforced birthplace of modern country music, but of a music that grew out of Black music traditions. So, like, it was looking, at the time, I don't think I recognized how special that was. Thinking about it now, I'm just so grateful that that was my summer internship, because it was so foundational to me. And to see what they're doing now with re-releasing the box set From Where I Stand, the concert that Reese just curated with Shannon Saunders, and like all of this, it's so heartening to see that museum step up and
Definitely.
do the work. It wasn't always that way.
No.
But they've really been stepping up. When was you were just in Nashville recently, right?
Yeah, a month ago-ish.
Have you been to the National Museum of African American Music?
No.
It is the most special museum in that city. I like friends who are at the Hall of Fame. You turn your speakers off for a few moments. I love the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. Do not get me wrong. But the National Museum of African American Music is stunning. It is the most gorgeous museum. It takes you chronologically through like modern music. And it is just so special. It's right across the street, actually, from, more or less, from the Ryman Auditorium. Maybe kind of like diagonal. Yeah, it's right downtown. It's like 3 blocks from the Hall of Fame, really.
Yeah.
And it's this beautiful immersive experience. You get a wristband. You sort of like collect music as you go through, and where you're building a playlist. You come out with like this gorgeous playlist of all genres of music by like, and just the stories that they tell are so, again, unless you study music history, you don't know them. You don't necessarily know the ways in which Black musicians have been exploited. So, and the ways in which they're celebrated. And so, like, it's not an easy story, but it's such an essential story. Highly recommend.
See, I always say, and my best friend can also vouch for this, I always say, like, I don't museum. But no, you're talking into it a little bit. We'll be going later this year, so I might have to museum. I just might have to museum.
Think of it as like playlist building.
Yeah. Research. It's always research.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a very interesting conversation, and it's interesting how all of these things that you say you're more versed in Nashville, like socially, right? And you see these things, then how all of this translates up to Canada. It's just what the U.S. is doing is what we're doing.
Yeah, with a little
scale.
bit of a delay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the thing that always fascinates me. So this is my giant warning. The U.S. is in a downward turn of representation of songs by women since 2020. It has declined. 2020, as of like April of this year, songs by women were played 8.97% of U.S. country radio. That's almost entirely white women, because it's only 0.24 for songs by Black women, and 0.2 was for Texas Hold'em. So when you then look at what's happening on the Canadian industry, we are also in decline.
Yep.
Also since about 2021. So it's interesting, because if you were to line up the graphics like side by side, you'd see that we're about a year behind where our decline starts. And so in 2023, songs by women on Canadian radio was at 15.6%. 15.2 for songs by white women, 0.4 for Black, Indigenous women of color, 0% for trans artists.
Do you ever get met with the question of there are less people in these categories of people, therefore they represent less, and how do you meet that conversation or that question?
Yeah, that is like the first thing people say. Well, there are just fewer women. I would say
there's not.
There are fewer women currently signed to major labels. That is accurate. But that is not accurate with regards to how many women are actively pursuing and making country music. And in order to have this conversation in a meaningful way, we really do need to look at the history of this topic, because women have always been underrepresented and underplayed and undersupported, and it's never been for a lack of artistry and women and trans artists actively making country music. But rather, it is this long-held cultural belief that women, and especially trans artists, are somehow bad for business. And it ends up being a chicken and an egg, because folks at radio will point to labels and say, well, there's not enough songs by women. Labels aren't sending us those songs. And then labels will say, well, you're not playing them. And so everyone just wants to pass the buck and point the finger. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is they've been doing this finger pointing since 1920s. I mean, probably not. Realistically, the 1960s, when the industry more formalized. But it doesn't really matter who did it first. What matters is that one influences the other. And somebody needs to be the bigger person in the conversation and step up and make a plan for change, because the other one will follow.
Yeah.
So if radio really wanted to change, they could, like that, start to change the way they do their business. Because you don't only need to play label-signed artists. You can play unsigned emerging artists very easily. There's no shortage of songs by women. And they're easy to find. The I don't know where to find them argument is another one that I hear, and it's absolute, utter, can I swear?
Yep.
Bullshit.
I'm on swear jar. It's all good.
Perfect. It's absolutely false that there are not enough and that they're unfindable. I could name 100 right now. Literally. And if they were to do it, and they were to actually want to make change within their programming and reshape the industry, they could do it quickly and easily, and I encourage them to do so. And to make sure in Canada that you're not just doing it on the backs of international artists, and that you're actually making pathways for Canadian women to succeed in this industry, because right now they can't. And if that change were to happen at radio, labels would follow suit, because they'd want to have the artists that radio wants to be playing. But nobody wants to make change, because right now the status quo makes big bucks. And nobody's bottom line is hurting so long as they're plugging Morgan Wallen and Luke Combs.
With full knowledge that they haven't tried the other option.
Right.
And don't know that it would also make money, because they've just run on that same assumption that women don't sell.
Yeah. And they're doing also on the false practice of every once in a while throwing a couple of new songs by women in there and registering every little change as a negative against women. And one of the places in which I saw this most actively was as we entered pandemic and CMT launched their Equal Play campaign. Some stations really did try to add more songs by women, But like the second things got tough, they returned back to status quo, and they blamed the toughness on songs by women. There also tends to be this practice of like, in the first half of the year, they'll plug in more songs by women so that they will all sort of like peak out by July and August and September. And then the back end of the year, there's like no new songs coming up the pike in, in the top of the charts, because they've already peaked and they're gone. Like they're like doing all their work in January, February, March, so that those songs will later become number one, but then they don't fill the gap behind them. So like there's a real problem in not in like consistency, in like a continued effort for making change, and recognizing that you can't just add and stir. You have to actually like redo the way you do things, because the way you do things is actually built for white men by and for producing white men hit makers. Also, like, they need to change their way of, like, they all say that, like, oh, it's not a hit, it's not a hit. Well, my friend, y'all make them hits. Songs aren't born hits. Somebody has to press the button and make them so. And so they could make any one of these artists a hit. Yeah, there's my monologue.
No, this is, I knew we'd get into this and it would just continue. And you're obviously very, like, dedicated to the research that you've done, and it shows the results are obvious. So your most recent study that was published was called Share the Air.
Yeah.
Why don't you just give the key points on what those findings showed and how you got to those findings?
Share the Air is a really special project to me. It's one that I'd actually conceived of back in 2021, but that didn't start to become a reality for me until March of 2023, when I met with Heather Gibson at the National Arts Centre to discuss a potential partnership around representation on radio. Robin Stewart, Executive Director of Women in Music Canada, then joined the partnership team. This project grew out of conversations that all of us had been having about representation within the industry. For Heather and Robin, it was the lack of women as headlining acts on festival stages. And for me, of course, it really centered about the role that radio plays within that industry ecosystem, since that's the focus of my research program. Radio was a natural entry point into this conversation for all of us, because it tells us a lot about the changing dynamics of the industry. Which artists are signed, which artists are getting supported, which artists are then, charting within the industry, and how that might lead to invitations to perform on festival stages and even be eligible for industry award nomination. I worked on the project for about a year with a small team of doctoral students at the University of Ottawa. Unadi Patel of the Digital Transformation and Innovation Program here at U Ottawa was on the team in the early months to help with data coding. And Eugénie Tessier in this Department of Sociology became a main collaborator. She's actually worked with me for a number of years on SongData projects and joined this project with many roles. She did some research support, she copy edited the entire English draft, and she took on the mammoth responsibility of translating the entire report and all supporting materials into French. It was important to us that this report be available as both Share the Air and Partageons les ondes. And finally, my colleague and friend Bronwyn Parks of Feisty Creative designed the entire report, the cover art, the layout, the gorgeous social media graphics that are released each week via Women in Music Canada's platforms. Bronwyn really has been integral to taking the research and giving it an identity that is really meaningful and draws on a lot of my previous research in the design of that cover art. So it's really special to me to have worked with this incredible team of artists and researchers. I had pitched to them, like in March of 2023, that if we were going to look at radio, this is how I would do it. It would be this deep intersectional study of representation across all 6 formats that Mediabase monitors, and look at the top 150 songs played over an 11-year period, and then a deep dive into 2023, looking at overall airplay, time of day, current recurrent gold, CanCon designation, charts, etc., and just like really go as deeply as possible for each of these 6 formats, country being the lead format in the report. And in many ways, like, not surprising to anyone who read it, but certainly not to me, because I'd already done a lot of work on the Canadian country industry. So, you know, seeing a decline over that 11-year period wasn't a surprise. There was a bit of a bump in 2020 and 2021, but we're in another period of decline. And the deep dive on 2023 was perhaps most fascinating to me, because it showed, you know, songs by women were programmed at 15.6% last year, 15.2 for white women, 0.4 for women of color. You know, I'd say in general that songs by women are programmed more heavily in the evenings and overnights. But what was interesting for me is, like, that's true, but those day parts are actually like longer. So what was interesting to me is that they consistently program songs by women at 2 songs per hour on the country format. And so
that was
when you're
big one that stood out when you were initially presenting that too.
Yeah, right? Because it's like, it's a ratio of 5 to 1, 5 songs by men for every song by, or yeah, 1 song by a woman for every 5 songs by men. Works out to about 2 songs an hour. And let's say those 2 songs happen to be played back to back. Then you've got the rest of the hour. And what if you start the hour with 2 songs back to back, and then you end the next hour with, like, you could go in this country, you could easily go over an hour without hearing a song by a woman. Of course, disconcertingly, like, airplay goes predominantly to you know, when you think about CanCon, airplay is like at a higher percentage for international artists, so Americans. Canadian women have less airplay overall. And that sort of, that representation splits the deeper you get into the charts, where, you know, you get into the charts and it's like even more representation of American artists. And this is not to say that American artists shouldn't be played, but in a country that has regulations to build pathways and an ecosystem for Canadian artists, it's really not doing the job for anybody, but especially for women. And so it is a really disheartening ecosystem to look at, because even though Canadian radio is playing about 6% more than the United States, our system is not serving Canadian artists in any meaningful way. No. So that any number ones for Canadian artists, you really have to you have to think about how hard that was to happen. And most of these artists live in Nashville and have also a bit of a Nashville machine behind them. And so what happens to the Canadian artist who wants to remain in Canada and build their career here? Well, that is a significant barrier. So those findings were again, really not surprising for me, but what's lovely now is we can move beyond this place of anecdote. You know, we can move beyond the place of oh, well, we know it's bad. Well, now we know how bad it is. Mm-hmm. And there are so many easy things that could be done. And having hard facts, I think, is really important. And, I'm mindful that this is not easy for artists to see. I have no idea, actually, if artists have seen this study. Actually, it's not true. I know of a couple who have. But I don't know how they feel. And I recognized after we released the report that I really didn't offer any kind of a warning. I usually offer a trigger warning with my work when I release it, but I didn't really control the release of it this time. So I'm very mindful that a lot of those findings might not be a surprise, but might still be really hurtful. Or not hurtful, but they might hurt. artists, especially women of color, and especially trans artists. So I'm very mindful that there were some missed opportunities to really think about like how to release this in a way that would protect artists a bit more from what they were going to see.
For sure. I know a few that I shared with. It was the same thing. It was we knew it was bad, but now we see how bad it is. And that sucks. As somebody who's investing time, money, debt into a career here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's definitely tough. What is your this, we can't end on such a negative note. So I'm thinking,
All right.
when we think about like the path forward, what are things that we want to be doing? What do we need to be doing?
Yeah, I do love this question. I mean, first and foremost, I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't say educate. In the report, there are footnotes throughout with resources. There's also a giant bibliography at the end that provides, links to as much journalism as I could possibly include that really tries to recount the whole industry for the last 10 years. But I link to studies by groups around the world. So one, we can see that this is not just a Canadian issue. It's not even just an American issue. I have friends and colleagues in Ireland and the UK who do this same work where it's similar results. And so seeing that there's a global issue going on, because this really goes, it's boundaryless. Sexism has no boundaries. Neither does racism. And finding the resources in there that are going to help folks really get to know what this history is, because without knowing that, there is no pathway forward. We also included at the end of the report, I wrote this section that's just called Share the Air, which are some recommendations for folks to think about. And so my first thought going forward is like, please, please, please don't just add and stir. Really think about what your practice means and how you do your work, because you basically have to undo all of it. And it needs to be thoughtful and meaningful, because every way the industry has been using and counting data has to be sort of rethought now, because it's always been with a certain goal. The goals are different now. But some pretty basic things is like, program songs by women back to back. Let their songs be heard in proximity. Let their stories linger together. Aim higher than CanCon. And I say this knowing that we have some companies within this ecosystem that are actively decimating their CanCon, right? Like they're eliminating their medium and low rotation spots for Canadians. That's going to kill the industry, hands down. That's only really going to do positive things for Gord Banford and Brett Kissel. Like, women are screwed in this new programming thing. So, when I say program more Canadian content, I don't just mean a couple of white men. The big one for me, because there's a few recommendations, but the big one, the most important one, the thing that could have the most meaningful impact is rebuilding golds. About 40% of what country radio programs are gold catalog songs, these, goldies or oldies that are, canonical to the industry. The songs that make you think, I love country. This is country to me. Oh, I actually don't like that. That's a gatekeepery thing. But it defines what country means and sounds like. But women and trans artists are not included in that canon. And so for me, most important work can be done with rebuilding those golds by doing the work to go back through them and to think, whose voices are missing? Whose stories have we not saved? Because if the marker of moving a song from recurrent into golds is that it hit, the top 10 or was a number one hit, well, songs by women haven't been afforded those opportunities. They've not been pushed into the top 10. They have barely been pushed to the number one, and trans artists are absolutely invisible. So there's some manual work to be done to go back and think of like who all those women were who came all over the last 2 to 3 decades, and find their stories and reintroduce them into golds, and just build more meaningful practices of preservation, and recognize that there's gonna have to be a new way of building golds going forward, one that is more inclusive, one that actually has a view to understanding that this work is history building, and that the continued erasure of Black, Indigenous women of color is actually harmful. I didn't end more positively.
Okay, final thing then. Where should people go to learn more? In general, where are you looking?
Ooh,
other than
some of my favorite things. Yeah, I mean, whatever. Go to SongData.ca if you like. That would be lovely. But there are so many places to go for some great content. Color Me Country with Reese Palmer. If you have an Apple subscription, you can listen to all of her interviews with BIPOC artists. If you don't listen every Saturday at noon, you can listen to it live for free. Proud Radio with Hunter Kelly. Record Band with Kelly McCartney. The Kelly Bannon Show. Clearly I'm an Apple lover. There's so many places. I mean, go to the Nashville, go to the Country Music Hall of Fame and the National Museum of African American Music. And I mean, there's also some really great blogs. I don't know if I should call it a blog, newsletter, bulletin, like Don't Rock the Inbox, by Marissa Moss and Natalie Weiner. Yeah, there's really no shortage. In fact, on my website, I have a tab that's called under projects and under radio data. There's support #change country. And there's a list of resources, podcasts, radio shows. Yeah. 2 more plugs that I will give is Black Opry, who I think are doing the most important foundational work. They just launched a record label. They're going to release Jet Holden's first album sometime this fall. And check out the Country Everywhere database. It's a directory and community hub of BIPOC, 2S LGBTQIA+, and disabled voices within the industry. It's Canadian built, run by my friend Jeremy LaRue in Vancouver. And it's such a great place. Like, if for anyone who's listening is how can I change my programming? There's a whole database of artists. If you're looking for somebody to write, there's also writers in there. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending the hour with me. I feel like we got into it, but we could sit here for probably 2 more hours.
I would feel bad for everyone if they had to let's talk for 2 hours.
Fair enough. Where can people find you on the internet?
I am on Instagram and Twitter, which I will never call the other name, at data_Jada. Or SongData.ca is my website.
Perfect.
Thanks for listening to another episode of On the Porch with Front Porch Music. We're so lucky to be able to chat with artists and make episodes like this one. If you like the podcast, remember to rate and review us, and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. It's the easiest way to support the show. Remember to check out frontporchmusic.ca to keep up with new music releases, exclusive artist interviews, and more. We'll catch you again on the porch in a couple of weeks. On the Porch is hosted by Logan Miller and Jenna Weiser, and produced and edited by Jason Saunders. That's me. Our theme song was written, produced, and performed by Owen Wrigley.